Today I'm going to be giving you some practical ideas about how you can actually find some success in raising your kid with RAD. And I'm going to start by telling you a little bit of my story. So my late husband and I adopted two kids out of foster care. Devin, who was 3 at the time, and his sister Kayla, who was 2. They have the same mom, different dads. And we totally jumped in heart first. I had been a foster parent even as a single person, and then after I got married, I was a foster parent again. And so I had always dreamed of adopting kids out of foster care, so this was like a dream come true for me. And they did have some behavioral issues when we first got them. They both had food issues. Kayla would graze and eat all the time. Devin would eat until he made himself throw up, and he would hoard food. He also had some potty issues. He would urinate around the house. He would take his feces out of the toilet and play with it. And they both screamed like I had never heard kids scream before. In fact, we had at one point our neighbor knocking on the door threatening to call the police because they were screaming. They thought we were abusing them, but of course we weren't. This was pretty normal behavior for kids who've been in foster care, kids who've been abused or neglected. And so if you've ever been involved with the foster care system, you know those types of behaviors are really normalized. And we're told they're normal. These kids just need the love of a forever family. That's what we were told. We believe that. And so we really jumped in. So this is a picture of all my kids, maybe 2 years or so after the adoption. So on the left is my son, Amias, that's my birth son. And then next is my adopted stepson, who's quite a bit older than the other kids. And on his lap is Brandon, my youngest birth child. He was born about a year after the adoption was finalized. And then my adopted son, Devin, and his sister, Kayla. So you can see I had 3 kids very close in age, within about 18 months of each other, my biological son and then my 2 adopted children. So as I said, they did come to us with some issues, and we fully expected that they would heal in our home. And my daughter, Kayla, she did get a lot better. It took time, but a few things that worked for her. She got on some ADHD medication, and I know that's a lot of times that is a misdiagnosis for RAD kids, but it wasn't for her. The reason I knew that is because it worked. The medication immediately worked, so I knew this was a good diagnosis and medication for her. Also, we were able to get her an IEP, and that she was able to overcome a learning delay, graduate from high school. When she came to us, she loved animals more than people. She would have told you she loved her dog more than she loved me, for sure. But over time, she was able to transfer that to people. So today she's 21, she still lives with me, and if she has a really rough day, she'll come and get in my bed and sleep with me, like I'm her security blanket. So she has the ability to attach. It just took her a while. So she was the kind of kid who you can definitely work with in your home and get some success. Also, she was diagnosed with bipolar, and getting her on some medication was really a game changer for us. So I would definitely recommend looking into possible comorbidities your kids might have, because you do need to deal with, I know Forrest talked about, some other people talked about that, but you need to deal with those other types of things that they may be dealing with. Now, unfortunately, my son, Devin, he did not adjust over time. The first thing I noticed was that there seemed to be what I used to call a disconnect in the way he was thinking. So I had 3 kids about the same age, put them in timeout. My birth son, Amias, and my other adopted daughter, they would totally understand, because of course behavior modification does work with some kids. But it didn't matter how many times I would put Devin in timeout, he just didn't get it. And I thought at the time, because I didn't understand what's going on, I just thought there was like a disconnect. He wasn't understanding the link between his behavior and the consequences. And we tried everything. We did play therapy, talk therapy. He would talk in baby talk, which I, of course, didn't know at the time what that was all about. So I put him in speech therapy. We tried medications. ADHD medications did not work for him. IEP, nothing worked. And he was just continuing to escalate. His behaviors were escalating. By the time he was in kindergarten, 1st grade, he had punched his teacher in the stomach, punched his classmates. He had pulled the door off the hinges in his bedroom. He would chase his siblings around with baseball bats, and when he got mad at me, he would spit in my face. And of course, no one believed that this was happening, including his father. So I worked from home, but his father was out, and my son would be in a complete, what I used to call a tantrum, but it was a rage. And when he heard the garage door open, he would just snap it off like a light switch. And it wasn't because he was afraid of his father. His father wasn't going to come in and spank him because his father actually was going to side with him over me, because he thought this was just a parenting issue because he never saw it. And he would say that in front of my son. He'd say, this is a parenting issue. You need to parent him better, which of course is incredibly demoralizing. I'm sure some of you have experienced this. There was a Mother's Day where my kids didn't give me anything. You know, when your kids are little, dad helps them get a Mother's Day gift. And so I was upset. And I said to my husband, you know, why didn't you help my kids get me a Mother's Day gift? And he said, because you don't deserve it, because you're a bad mom. Oh. So, and this is part of a lot. I'm sure there's other people in this room who have had this story happen to them. But this is how good some of these kids can be at triangulating and hiding their behaviors. And this is the kind of thing that happens, because it wasn't just my husband who was doing that. It was everyone around me. They were telling me, you just need to love him more. You need to hug him more. And I knew something was wrong with him, but what I really knew was that there was something wrong with me. I knew something was wrong with me because I didn't love him. I didn't know how to parent him. And this was just being echoed by everyone around me. So, change my slide here. So after several years of living like this, I was in a terrible place. And, you know, we've talked a lot in this conference about our kids and their horrific behaviors. But I think one of the things we don't always talk about is how this can really do something ugly to us too, right? And I don't think it's so much about the behaviors. It's about the fact that it's relentless. It's living with it day after day, year after year, never ending. And a lot of us, we don't have anyone to give us relief. We don't have a break. We have friends, family, our husbands, whoever it is, who's telling us, you're a terrible mother, right? And so it's just compounding. And so I think it can become something really, really ugly. So, for example, normally, traditional parenting, your kid is at school, they come home and they're the only kid who didn't get invited to the birthday party, right? And you feel devastated with them. And so you comfort them and you tell them, you reassure them, this is not your fault. You know, it's not your fault you didn't get invited to the birthday party. And maybe during the birthday party, you distract them and you come up with something to help them feel distracted so they don't feel bad about not being invited to the birthday party. Not after RAD. When my RAD kid didn't get invited to a birthday party, I was thrilled because he was finally going to get some consequences, right? And he was going to have those natural consequences. And I said to him, let me tell you exactly why you're not invited to that party, right? And I would sit him down during the birthday party and say, you sit here and you think about why you're not going to that birthday party, right? This is where we get, some of us, maybe it's just me, but some of us get to this point where we're doing these things that are just a little, they're not okay, right? They're not positive. They're not good parenting because of where we're at. So these natural consequences, they are not inherently bad. They're not necessarily bad. But I think for RAD parents, they can become very, very negative. And most importantly, they don't work. I have people contacting me all the time who are talking to me about this and how, you know, they want their kid to understand. They want them to have consequences. That's not going to work. But this is where I was mentally when my son was about 8 or 9 years old. I was not thinking clearly. I had developed a sleeping disorder. I had anxiety and depression, complex PTSD, although I didn't know it yet. And quite frankly, I just was not a good mom anymore because I couldn't be. I was being asked to do something that I just did not have the capacity and ability to do. I could not take care of this child. He was beyond my ability to care for. So I think most parents who are parenting kids with RAD kind of have two major turning points. And since you're at this conference, you've already reached the first one, which is realizing that you need help. And for me, that happened when my son was 9 years old. And he pushed my 4-year-old son face first down the stairs. And I was sitting at the bottom of the stairs, looking up, thinking, oh my God, this is so dangerous. Someone is going to get hurt. Someone could actually get killed. And of course, I should have had that wake-up call a few years before that. But when you're in the middle of it, you know, you're just trying to survive every day. It's very hard to have that perspective and see. Sometimes something has to happen that's tragic like that to understand. So that's when I started really trying to get some help. And we went through the mental health ER, which is where a lot of parents start. And at the time, I got some really good advice from someone, which was to just keep taking him there. Even though he loved going to the hospital, even though the hospital staff wasn't nice to me and acted like I was crazy, just keep taking him because then the health insurance will eventually cover other services. And that's what I did. And it was very difficult, even just logistically. I would be driving, he'd be trying to climb out the window, he would be kicking the headrest of the car, but I still took him. After 4 or 5 times, that is when we finally were able to get some other treatment approved, and we got intensive in-home care. Now, for those of you who've had that, you'll know intensive in-home does not work for kids with RAD. But what worked for me was that someone finally saw this rage behavior. After a few weeks, one of the workers that was there actually witnessed him throwing a fit, and they immediately said, this kid is not safe to be in your home. He needs to be in RTF. And that is how I got him in RTF, was by someone actually seeing it. Now, I really thought when he went into this RTF that he was going to get treatment, he was going to get better. Remember, at this point, he had not been diagnosed with RAD. I didn't even know what RAD was. So he went to the RTF. Within about 6 months, he was diagnosed with RAD, and that actually made me even more encouraged. I thought, for sure, now we know what it is. It has a name. I can get him treatment. And so I was very positive that he'd be coming home. So what I did is I immediately got myself a therapist. I was extremely broken. And I went into the therapist and I said, something is wrong with me. I don't love my son. I need help. Because I knew he was coming back. And she was the one who helped me understand that I had developed complex PTSD, helped me work with my doctor, get on anxiety medications, which really helped me a lot. And she also helped me understand that I had not had any time to allow myself to have those love feelings for my son, because from the time he came to me, he was having these reactions towards me and treating me in this way and spitting in my face, and that was actually, my response was pretty normal. It would be abnormal for me to have these love feelings towards him. And that didn't take away the guilt, but it did help me understand what was going on. And sometimes I think just understanding what's going on can help us so much in our journey. So it took me a good 2 years of my son being out of my house for me to begin to recover from what I had been through. So meanwhile, I was getting better. My other kids were healing and getting better. But my son was in RTF and he was getting worse. One of the first calls that I got was that they wanted to let me know that he had been flipping desks and he had been threatening all the other kids. And so they had to take him out of the room. And they said, but don't worry, Miss Williams. He was able to pull himself together in time to go swimming. And I just about lost my mind. But I quickly learned that that's just how RTF works. Most RTFs work. So he also, his behavior was escalating. He stabbed a girl in the back of the head with a pencil because he wanted to have the computer she was on. He broke one of the staff people's thumbs. He also was in physical restraints multiple times a week, sometimes multiple times a day. And I was thinking, well, what am I going to do when he comes home? You know, he's got like 3 or 4 men who are there restraining him and watching him. I can't do that. As he's getting worse, he also started to have suicidal ideations. And again, most people, the therapist thought that he was doing that just for control. He wasn't trying to kill himself. But I was thinking, he's going to come home, he's going to wrap something around his neck, and I'm not going to find him in time because I'm not there to watch him every single second. I've got other kids, I've got a job, you know, I have to take a shower. So I was really trying to figure out what was I going to do. And at one point, he was in a group home, and the therapist told me that he had a plan to burn down the group home. And I said to her, I said, you don't really think he would burn down the group home? He's just saying that. And she said, oh, yes. She said he would. That's what makes these kids so dangerous, is that they will do anything to get what they want. And so I look at that like I have my biological son, who's very close in age to my adopted son. My biological son, Amias, you know, if he at that age had gotten mad at me, he might have stomped his feet, he might have slammed the door, maybe been rude to me. He has an upper limit. He would never have spit in my face. He would never have cursed me out. He would never have hit me, right? But these kids, they don't have that upper limit. It's like playing a game of chicken. They just keep going and going and going. And that's how my son was. And so this brought me really to my second turning point that many RAD parents reach, which is realizing that there is no cure for RAD. And for kids on the severe end of the spectrum, in most cases, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to find help. We kind of come to the realization that you can only manage the symptoms, and that cannot always be done safely at home. And that's when I realized my son could not return home. So I had been fighting with these RTFs because my goal was to bring him home, to get him better, to bring him home. So I was saying, you know, you can't treat him this way at RTF because when he comes home, I won't be able to handle him. But my goals changed because I realized I actually needed him to stay at the RTF. So instead of fighting with them, I needed to work with them to keep him there because that's where he would be safe. Now this, of course, is a terrible choice to have to make. Some of you may have faced this or you may face this in the future, but I literally had to pick between my kids at home and my kid with RAD because he was not getting better in RTF. He was actually getting worse. But I still had to leave him there because I knew I could not help him, and I knew that if I brought him home, it would be harmful to my other kids. And that is a choice that a mother should never have to make, but that is what a lot of RAD parents face. So I had to really start looking at things differently. I think in life, we all look through a lens. I'm sure you've kind of heard people use that metaphor. We look through a lens, and parenting is no different. So when we have our kids and we look through that traditional parenting lens, usually it's about helping our child reach their potential, right? So we look at it and we say, you know, I look at my son who has RAD and his potential, and we look at, can we help them reach their potential? So if we have like an athletically gifted child, we're trying to put him in AAU, and if we have a kid who wants to be a doctor, we're trying to help them do well in school. None of that applies to kids with RAD, especially if they're on this severe end of the spectrum. And the reason is RAD is such a big, all-consuming disorder, they cannot access that potential right now. So even if they have it, they can't access it because right now they're dealing with RAD. And worse than that, they do not want to reach their potential right now, right? So, and this goes back to that whole control symptomology of RAD. So you can have a kid who's very musically gifted, for example, put them in piano lessons. They're not going to practice. They're going to choose not to practice. They're going to tell you they hate piano. And there is nothing you can do about it. So you are fighting a losing battle by trying to help them reach their potential. Maybe that's going to happen when they become adults and they want to reach their potential. But right now, they don't want to. And so our goal can't be about them reaching their potential. It has to be much simpler than that. It has to be something that we have a little bit more control about. So my goals became very simple, as I said, to keep my son in RTF where he would be safer and to make sure that when he turned 18, he was not coming home, that he was going to be somehow independent, that I was going to find a way that he would be able to be on his own or in some sort of facility at 18, but he did be independent. I also started really focusing on my other children. This is by far, and I know we've talked about siblings a lot, this is my biggest regret. Is that I did not realize how this was impacting my children, my other children for years. And even my youngest in the womb was actually exposed to this kind of environment. There was the same unpredictability and instability that you get if you're exposing your kids to domestic violence. So my kids, you know, for example, they didn't know if they were going to have their homework ready to go to school the next day. You know, were they going to get to go to basketball practice, or was their brother going to throw a fit? They could never have their friends over. And so that's all the same type of things that kids who are exposed to domestic violence deal with. And that was very impactful and damaging to my other kids. So I began to prioritize my other kids. And lastly, I started looking out for myself. My own mental health, as I already spoke about a little bit, had really deteriorated. At my worst point, I had not brushed my hair in literally 3 months. And that's not good. That wasn't good for me. It wasn't good for my kids. It wasn't good for anyone. And so I had to also look at these battles that I'm fighting. What's this doing to me? And is it worth the impact that it's going to have on me? So I refocused myself on these goals, and it definitely was not easy, but I was able to keep my son in care. He stayed in RTF until he turned 18. He actually never did return home. So where are we at today? My son is 22 today. He lives about a half an hour from my house. I see him a few times a year. He was actually at my house this past weekend for a couple hours for a party. And I text message with him a lot. So this is a picture I sent him of our cat, whose name is Turtle, which is a whole nother story. But I sent him this picture of Turtle, and you can see he responded back to me, and he said, "Now that right there is adorable." This represents extreme success for me, parenting a kid who's on the severe end of the spectrum of RAD. And here's why. First of all, when I took this picture of Turtle and I decided to send it to my son, I felt good about it. I wasn't being manipulated by a therapist into some phony attachment. I didn't feel anger towards him. I didn't feel that sickness and bitterness that I used to feel about every interaction that I had with him. It was like as if I was sending it to my friend or my sister or my other kids. I just was like, oh, he'll think this is cute. Let me send this to him. And so that really represents a lot of healing for me. Also, you can see his response. He's responding in a positive way. He's not being rude or aggressive. And I know all of you in this room know there's a time when you can send your kid a cute picture of a cat and he can still be rude to you, right? So the fact that he's choosing to just have a positive interaction with me, this to me is showing some success and some growth. And finally, this is about safety for me. So my son, he's 22. This was actually when he was 21, this particular text, but he's texting me from an iPhone that I pay for that is on my family plan. Now, I understand completely, because I've been there, the impulse of saying, hey, you're 18, you're on your own. You want a phone? Go get a job, right? Learn how to get a job so you can have a phone. But honestly, this is the best $40 a month I spend. Because my son sees me as this ally and his friend. And he is empty inside. He doesn't have a conscience, at least that I've seen. He's very transactional. So, because he has that iPhone in his pocket that his mom gave him, he's going to think twice before he does something that's going to hurt me or hurt his siblings. And it is literally that basic when you have a kid that is operating in this level. It's just the sad reality of things. And so I am happy to pay for that phone. And also I have Find My iPhone on it. So I'm able to see where he is. And so these are sometimes some of the kind of practical, pragmatic steps that you have to take when you have a kid who's on the more severe end of the spectrum. Now, when I adopted my son, I would never have considered this successful. I would have thought that was ridiculous, what I just said. But you all know that when we're parenting kids with RAD, especially kids on the severe end of the spectrum, we are underwater. I was drowning at one time, and probably some of you in this room feel like you are drowning. And when you're drowning, what you need to do is you just need to get everybody's head above water. That includes getting your own head above water, your kid with RAD, your other kids, your spouse. You have to focus on survival sometimes. And depending on the situation in your child, if you're like in my situation, surviving might be all you can do. And that's a really amazing feat for you to survive this. I look back at how I lived and what I went through, and I cannot believe I lived that way. It was worse than I even thought it was at the time. So we have to really look at things differently when you realize, hey, this is not traditional parenting. I cannot apply those same standards. I cannot have those same expectations. I'm going to fail at that. But you can find some success by looking at things differently. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to focus on some practical, it's going to come up, some practical ways to approach parenting when you kind of are looking at things through a RAD lens. And I do want to say, though, that this primarily applies to families who are in crisis. If you have your kid and you have a great RAD therapist, if you're in a facility that happens to really specialize in RAD, that is great. Just put this in your back pocket for if you need it in the future. Because a lot of what I'm saying is really about when you are in survival mode and how you can survive. But in principle, it does still apply to even kids who are on the mild end. And I'll give you an example. For example, my daughter, who I said still lives with me, she's 21. She has a job. And if it was up to her, she would get her paycheck and she would literally spend every cent that same day. And she's done that many times. So now what we do is when she gets her paycheck, I transfer a couple $100 out of her account to my account, and then I give her back $15 a day. So she has spending money. Now, if you look at that from a traditional parent, if this was a traditional regular parenting conference, everyone would say, wow, you're really failing at teaching your kid how to manage money, right? But for a RAD kid, that's actually a lot of success. I mean, she doesn't have to comply with that. She's 21. She could say, no, Mom, you can't take my money and give it back to me. But the fact that she's complying and she's choosing to try to manage her money responsibly that way, that is successful. So there are things, even with kids who are on the more mild end of the spectrum, where you can try to look at things differently and try to imagine success differently based on what their capabilities are and what their needs are. And you're going to find that you feel a lot better than trying to achieve these standards that you're not going to be able to achieve with these kids. So the first thing I want to talk about is kind of how to do this in your everyday, day-to-day life. So when my son, before he went to RTF, his chore was to take out the trash. And Of course, traditional parenting, right? That makes sense. Kids need chores. They need to grow up to be responsible adults, and that's how we do it. We give them chores. But that is not what was happening in my home. It was not teaching him to be responsible. What it was doing is every single day giving him a chance to humiliate me by not doing what I said. That's what I was doing. I was giving him a chance to win. I was giving him a chance to feel like he was the one who was strong and powerful. And it didn't matter how I could to this day be telling him to take out the trash. I swear he still would not have taken out the trash. It was never going to work anyway. So instead of locking myself into that pointless struggle, what I wish I had done in retrospect is looked at how it was affecting my other kids. Because it wasn't going to benefit my son either way, but it was affecting my other kids. They were late to school some days because of this conflict. They were going to school stressed out because they were hearing us arguing about it. They were hearing this battle back and forth. And that should have been more important to me. Now, I didn't have the wherewithal at the time to realize that. But in retrospect, that's what I realized. I should have said, you know what? I'm not even going to give him this chore. I'm not going to give him the chance to humiliate me by saying no. I'm just not going to tell him to do it. And then I'm going to take care of my other kids and make sure they're not stressed out going to school. Similarly, you know, if I could have a redo, I would definitely, in all those conflicts, be asking myself, is this battle with my rad kid worth sacrificing my other kids for? So, for example, on my daughter's 8th birthday, my rad son was grounded from dessert. And I'm not even going to tell you all the backstory to that because I'm sure you know well how that would have happened. So he was grounded from having dessert. And so he flipped into a rage and he ruined her birthday party. And looking back, honestly, I should have just let him have the cake. But I had lost perspective, right? Because we kind of get obsessed with, we got to enforce the consequences. We have to be consistent. It doesn't matter how many times I kept cake for my son. He was not going to behave. That was never going to work. But what was it going to do? It was going to ruin my daughter's birthday party, right? But I wasn't thinking like that. I was still thinking about it from the other angle of how can I try to make my son comply, which was not going to work. And I should have prioritized my daughter's needs. And now, I know what you're all thinking because I would have thought it. That sounds great in theory, but if I give my son the cake, he's going to spin out of control and I'm going to pay for that later, right? But the truth is that this is a no-win situation. If you don't give it to him, he's going to flip into a rage and ruin his sister's birthday party. If you do give it to him, yeah, he's going to say, I beat my mom, I won, and you're going to pay for that later, right? But either way, you're not going to win. So you may as well prioritize your daughter, let her have her birthday party. And what I would say is this is where we need to know our limits, because if your child is this dysregulated like my son was, being more authoritative, being more strict is not going to work. That is when you need to start looking at possibly out-of-home care if your child is that dysregulated. I want to say a little bit about school. I get a lot of people contacting me about school. And one mom contacted me and told me about her middle schooler daughter who was caught vaping at school. And she was really upset because the school had a zero tolerance policy and anybody who was caught vaping got suspended, which is, you know, pretty normal. Well, of course, not the rad kid. She went and she sweet-talked the principal and got out of being suspended and she wasn't going to be punished for vaping. And the mother was just out of her mind. She was so upset. And she was going to go into the school and she was going to tell the principal, you need to suspend my kid. She needs to follow the same rules as everyone else. She needs the consequence. And I do agree with that in principle. I do. But here's the thing. Is that suspension going to help stop the kid from vaping? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Is it going to make them think twice before misbehaving at school again? Absolutely not. In fact, what it might make them think is, gee, I know how now to get suspended from school if I feel like I don't want to be in school, right? So if we go back to looking at what are our goals, if our goal is for our child to be independent, right? We want them in school. So getting suspended for vaping is not going to help with that. And we want to take care of ourselves and our other kids. And having them suspended and home is certainly not going to help the other kids or mom's mental health, right? So in that case, I mean, honestly, I'd be going in there with a Starbucks for that principal and saying, thank you so much for exempting my child and letting them and keeping them in school and not suspending them. And I know it's a really hard to wrap your mind around thinking that way, but that is a way forward for these kids. For most of these kids that have RAD, keeping them in school is the way forward. This also comes to when you keep helping them get a diploma. A lot of parents get upset because their kids are being promoted through school without doing the work. And we want them, we are like, well, they should fail. They should, suffer the consequences of the fact that they're not doing their homework. We should have them fail the class, have them fail the grade. A lot of people contact me about this, and I totally get it. There was a point in time when my son was getting straight A's, and I couldn't believe it. I'm like, how is this possible? And it turned out it was because he was only being graded for the 1 or 2 assignments a quarter he was choosing to do. And he was getting a whole lot of praise for that. And believe me, I understand. I lost my mind about it at that time. But here's the thing. It's really frustrating, but you want a way forward. And the way forward is for your kid to get through school. If they get held back, where do you think they're going to be living an extra year? Where do you think they're going to be staying an extra year, right? So I know it's frustrating, but that's how the school system works. And it's not just our RAD kids who are getting promoted like that. It's all kinds of kids. So take advantage of it. We need these things to help us get through. So don't worry about it. Take advantage of it and let them promote your kid on through. Let them get that diploma. It'll help them get a job. It'll help get them out of your house. And to that point also, if you don't have one, look into getting a 504 or an IEP for your kid, especially an IEP, because there are some legal protections to help prevent them from getting suspended again, because them being suspended does not serve any purpose. They are not going to learn from that. You're just going to suffer from that, and your other kids, right? So that's just a really pragmatic approach to school. Moving on to therapy. Therapy, of course, is one of the most frustrating parts of this whole RAD journey. And I definitely got locked into that loop where I wanted the therapist to understand. I wanted to be vindicated. I wanted them to see the truth about my kid. But the fact is that fighting with therapists is not a way forward. It's not going to help you. It's not going to help your child stay safe and be independent. It's not going to help your mental health. It's not going to work. So the first thing I would say that's very important is you need to remember that your child's therapist is not your therapist. I made a huge mistake when my son went to that first RTF, and I was very honest, and I told his therapist that I wasn't attached to him and that I was very angry. And for the next 2 years, that is all therapy was about. They literally would meet together without me to talk about how I could be a better mother, and then I would come into family therapy, and they'd say, we met, and we have some ideas about how you can, my son and the therapist, have some ideas about how you can be a better mother. So it's really, really important to remember these therapists are not objective. They are your child's therapist, and I strongly encourage everyone to get their own therapist, but do not open up to your child's therapist. Also, I made it way too easy for the therapist to blame me for my son's problems, especially early on before I kind of figured things out. First couple years, I was like one of those raving lunatics going in there, arguing with them, complaining about everything, and that did not serve me well. At one point, my son had convinced his therapist that the only way he could feel loved is if I would take him to Golden Corral when he came home for a visit. And so, of course, I was like, no way am I taking him to Golden Corral. No way. Because I knew he was manipulating her. And so I would go into the family therapy sessions and we'd talk about Golden Corral. And was I going to take him to Golden Corral this weekend? And I would explain again why no, I was not taking him to Golden Corral. My son would just sit there and watch us, smile on his face, happy watching us argue. And in retrospect, I should have just taken him to Golden Corral and taken it off the table, right? Something else would have come up, but I could have taken that off the table, right? And also, the therapist was thinking very badly of me, like I was a terrible, mean mother because I wouldn't take him to Golden Corral. And if I had taken him, she wouldn't have thought that way about me. And a lot of this has to do with how the therapist thinks about you. You know, you want them to think that you're a good, cooperative parent. You're going to get a lot better services that way. So to that point, it's really important to know when to move on. If the therapist does not have expertise with RAD, do not fool yourself into thinking that you can educate them. You cannot. You absolutely cannot. Believe me, your child is much more convincing than you are. All right, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is RTF, and I do want to make this clear. My son had Medicaid as an adopted foster child, so I only went to Medicaid facilities. My son was in 18 facilities over 18 years. So I have a lot of experience with a big breadth of those facilities. The worst advice that I've ever heard someone give about RTFs, I was on, I think it was a webinar, and a man was giving some advice, and he said, when you put your kid in RTF in the intake meeting, tell them very, very sternly, do not touch or hug my child or give them gifts or I will sue you. And I sat there thinking, well, that's a really good way to get yourself reported to CPS. It's a really good way to get your kid discharged. And again, I've made those mistakes before too, where I've said things like that to RTFs. But if you think about, if your goal is to keep your kid in RTF, which is what my goal was, you want to be conciliatory and polite and diplomatic. You do not want to be the difficult parent. That is not going to help anything. And I actually do totally understand the idea of saying to your RTS, hey, don't give my kid gifts. I get it. But if your kid is in a non-specialized RTF, it is not going to make a difference in the world if they get a gift or not. It's not going to make a difference because that RTF is not going to be able to treat this. And now if they are specializing in RAD, they're going to already know that. But most of the RTFs that our kids go into, they don't know. And it's just not going to make any difference. But what it is going to do is it's going to make that staff really suspicious of you, right? If you say, don't give my kid a gift, they're going to think you're the meanest mom in the world, the meanest dad in the world, right? They're going to immediately side with their kid. They're going to be very suspicious of you. And they may look for excuses to discharge your kid because they don't want to deal with a difficult parent. You can also find a lot of success in, well, not a lot, but you can find some success in understanding the rules of the system and using them. So this is really different in every state, but I'll give you an example of how this worked for me. So I figured out that kids in our system had to step down, so they had to go from RTF to group home to foster home. So you couldn't really go from RTF to home. And sometimes they would try to do that to me, and I would say, wait a second, no, that's not how the system works, because I knew how the system worked. And they also would talk about how these facilities are all about practicing being at home. So you would practice in a foster home, and if you could do well there, then you could go home and stay with your mom. So when I get into the discharge planning meetings, I would say, yes, I would love for Devin to come home. That is definitely my dream. But what I need for him to be in a foster home with younger siblings, because that would look like my home, with a single mom. Only I did have a husband, but he wasn't helpful. So that's why I said with a single mom. And have no suicidal or homicidal ideations for 3 months. And, that was very reasonable. And they had a really hard time arguing with me about that. And they would put him in that foster home, and he wouldn't be able to function, which proved he wouldn't be able to function in my home, and then he'd go back up the ladder in care. So that it may not be the same in your state, but I give that as an example to say you need to try to work with your system. Fighting the system is very rarely going to be successful. Working within the system, figuring out how it works and working within it is going to be more successful for you. And finally, if your kid does go into RTF, into hospitalization, into any of those things, use that time for yourself to recharge and heal, whether it's a 2-week hospitalization or a 3 months at an RTF. Go get yourself into therapy, get a massage, give the siblings a break, take them to Disney World. They're losing their childhood. Use that time wisely that you do have for yourself. Okay. The last thing that I want to talk about is some barriers to having our kids safe and independent at 18. We all say that we want our kid out of our house at 18, but we get stuck thinking about in terms of consequences and rewards and traditional parenting, and we sabotage ourselves and we sabotage them. Now, I talked a little bit about not having a high school diploma when I was talking about school. Another example is job experience. So a lot of times we know our kid's going to be good in the job, so we're like, hey, if you can behave in that job, then you can behave at home. So if you want a job, show me by behaving at home. And we try to use it as leverage. And we're really sabotaging ourselves and our kids' ability to be independent by doing that. We want them to get that job because when they're 18, they have to have a way to support themselves. So rather than using the job as leverage, or a driver's license as leverage, we need to really try to reframe that in our brain, that our kid is successfully working that job and he's on his way out of our house, and this is how we're doing it. and turn that into a positive for ourselves mentally. Also, if you have a daughter, having a baby, getting pregnant, that is a huge barrier to their success. So I strongly recommend get them an IUD. It doesn't matter if they're 13, if they're behaving like a 17-year-old or a 25-year-old, right? And I personally do not agree with that kind of behavior or the IUDs for the kids, but I'll tell you, an IUD for your kids is going to be a way forward in some of these situations, because otherwise you're going to be dealing with them and their baby. Another barrier to success is when our kids have a criminal record, and especially felony charges. I have really mixed thoughts on pressing charges. I've seen it often backfire on parents. The parents are the ones who end up having to pay the fines. They're the ones who have to drive them to community service. They're the ones who have the restrictions put on them. So a lot of times they're the ones who end up paying for it. Also for our kids who get felonies, in different state by state, but in a lot of states, felonies end up with a lifetime of issues. They can't get public housing. They have problems getting jobs, public assistance, all those things that they need in order to be independent. So there are times when charges are appropriate. Sometimes we don't have a choice. Sometimes they are necessary, but sometimes they're not. It's not that serious, and you need to think about that and think about the ramifications of your child having a felony. And I do know personally how tough this particular one is. My son was charged. He had some misdemeanors, but he also had 2 felony charges when he was 17. And when he went to court, the prosecutor refused to drop the charges because of what they were. But my son told a sob story to the judge. The judge felt bad for him. And so the judge put him in a drug program, which was basically a get out of jail free card for my son, because he had never had any drug issues at all. So all he had to do was pass these drug tests, which would be very easy, and then he would have these felonies expunged from his record. And so he was about 20, and I drove him to drug court one day, and I was actually very impressed with the program and what they were doing. And right before he got up, there was a woman who got up, and she was visibly shaking. And the judge said, great job, you've been sober for 2 days, and he told everyone to clap, and they all clapped for her. And then he talked very nicely to her about her situation and, made plans for her. And then it was my son's turn to get up, Devin, and I remember he has no drug problem at all. And he got up, and the judge said, wow, 147 days clean, everyone clap for him. And everyone clapped for him. And then he said, in my whole time being a judge, I have never seen anyone take this program so seriously and use the resources available to them. Everyone give him a standing ovation. And everyone in court stood and gave my son a standing ovation. And then he said to my son, he said, you should be so proud of yourself. Do you have anything you want to say? And he said, I don't want to brag. Now, I was completely outraged, obviously. This was like all the wrong lessons he was learning. He was basically getting away with those felonies, is what was happening, right? And the judge said to my son, he said, I heard your mom is here with you today. And my son pointed me out in the back of the court, and the judge said to me, Ms. Williams, do you have anything you want to say? And I had a lot to say. But I just said, no, sir, I've got nothing to say. And that's because there was a time when I would have said a lot in that situation, because I saw how broken it was. But my goal was for my son to remain independent, and him having a felony meant that he was coming back to me, and I was going to have to be responsible for a lot of things. And I knew in this particular circumstance, it wasn't like a violent crime or something like that. And so it was in my best interest to keep my mouth shut. But I just tell you, I know how tough it is what I'm asking you to do and telling you to keep your mouth shut. It is really hard because it's fundamentally unfair, some of these things. Finally, the last thing that I've seen that really keeps people from being successful in having their kids independent is when they're in an adversarial relationship with you. This took me a long time to learn. I used to call out my son all the time. I would go into therapy sessions. I would go into the team meetings every month, and I would call out his lies and call out what he did. And I'd take out my notebook and say he did this and he did this and he did that. And I would insist that he have consequences. I'd be like, are you kidding? Everybody's going to the amusement park next week. My son's not going. He just assaulted, these 3 people and he did all these things. The problem was my son heard me doing that. He knew I was the one. It was mom who was keeping him from going to the amusement park. And I realized eventually I was making myself into the enemy. And my son was going to be getting out eventually. I didn't know when it would be, but I knew at least when he was 18, at the very least, he would be getting out. And I was putting myself and my other kids at risk if I was his enemy. And so I stopped doing that. I still, when I was in the team meeting, or not in the team meetings, when I was talking on the phone to the counselors and to the caseworkers, I would certainly tell them in those meetings how I felt. But when my son was present, I did not say anything like that at all. I, in fact, tried deliberately to ally with him. I would say, what do you mean you don't have his favorite cereal? How can you not have his favorite cereal? And I would advocate for him for that so he would have positive feelings towards me, because him thinking I'm the enemy, it's only going to hurt me and it puts me at risk. And it's really me sitting in those meetings and complaining and saying how he's lying, he's doing these things. That's not going to change his behavior anyway. It's not going to work. So I want to end with this quote, which I think is really powerful. I am willing to make sacrifices, but I will not be the sacrifice. And I think that this is the position that a lot of us get into, where we are the sacrifice. And so today I just want to, the people here, I want to give you permission to stop putting your rad kid first and above your own well-being and the well-being of your other children. You are not obligated. And I know Forrest said this too. You are not obligated to destroy yourself and your marriage, and certainly not obligated to destroy your other kids. So don't let your family and friends and therapists make you feel guilty for prioritizing your other kids right along with your rad kid, prioritizing yourself. The sacrifices you are making are way more than enough. You are not required to be the sacrifice.